Okay, anyway, so let's get started. This week's Torah portion is Vaetchanan. It's our second Torah portion in the Book of Deuteronomy. And there's some very, very significant elements in this week's Torah portion. One is the Ten Commandments. We already had the Ten Commandments in Exodus as part of the historical account of what happened. When it happened, we have the Ten Commandments. And here in Deuteronomy, we have it repeated as part of Moses's discussion. But there's also something in this Torah portion that is very unique, and that is the Shema. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And that's usually translated as, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And so I want to, and then there's a few verses afterwards that are considered to be part of that prayer. Of course, it's that first statement, that first verse that is most important, but it continues as well for another few verses. So this is what I want to discuss today. But first, I want to put it into context. The word Shema Israel. So it is usually translated as hear or Israel. I think it's probably more accurate to say listen, Israel. Because usually when the difference between hear and listen, hear is usually considered a bit more passive. Listen is pay attention. Pay attention, not just hear this, but listen to it. Pay attention to it. So I would say that a more accurate way to translate this word Shema is listen. Listen up, Israel. Okay, I'm going to be telling you something now very important. Now, before we get to the actual Shema, as we call it, the Shema, that appears in chapter 6. But already in chapter 4, we see this, until this point, would be considered unique words, Shema Israel, listen Israel. And there's two, I would say, there's something unique about this. Let's start with Israel, okay? Here for the first time, Moses addresses the entire nation and calls them Israel. He doesn't say, people of Israel. First of all, usually until this point, even at the beginning of Deuteronomy, he just starts talking. In other words, you may have introductory language like, these are the words that Moses spoke to the nation of Israel, or these are the words that God spoke to the nation of Israel, or, God may say, okay, God says, okay, please, say this to Israel. And then when Moses actually speaks to Israel, whether it's in his name or he's bringing God's words, he just starts talking. You need to do this, you need to do that. This is what I'm telling you. Here, all of a sudden, for the first time, and we see it for the first time in chapter 4, verse 1 already, okay, we have listen, Israel. Okay, now in chapter 4, verse 1, it's Israel, listen. Okay, now Israel, listen to the laws and rules that I'm instructing you to observe. Okay, afterwards we get this language, Shema Israel, listen Israel. And it's not only in the Shema, which is in chapter 6, but we have a few times in chapter 4 that we have this. And then after chapter 6, this continues. So again, he addresses Israel and he says, Israel. Also, the word Shema. Shema is in Hebrew, your verbs are you conjugate your verbs depending on who you're talking to or about. They're masculine and feminine, and there's singular and plural. So Shema is a second person way of saying it. I'm talking to someone, I'm saying listen, okay? But it's also singular. So when he addresses Israel, he's addressing the nation of Israel, calling them Israel, okay, and saying it singular. It's not you guys listen, it's you individual listen, Israel. Okay, basically what we see here is that Moses is addressing the entire nation of Israel as if he was addressing one individual, Israel. Okay, and that in and of itself, I think, is interesting. Now, Israel is not only the name of the nation, Israel is another name for Jacob, our ancestors. Okay, and in fact, there is a midrash that says that essentially the first time, there's a tradition, this is not written in the Bible, but there's a tradition that says that actually the first time this verse was said was when the sons of Jacob turned to Jacob before he died, and they said, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," kind of basically assuring Jacob that indeed they, as their brothers, were going to remain faithful to the faith of their father Jacob, who's also called Israel. So whether or not that happened, I have no idea. But what this midrash, in a way, is coming to say is that it's sensitive to the fact that it's dressing the nation of Israel as if it was one individual. And maybe this statement indeed began speaking to the original Israel, who was that patriarch Jacob or Israel. But what I think is happening here, I think it's unique because I think, and special, because I think what Moses is doing now is he's moving from talking to everybody as this mass of people, and he's trying to talk to the whole nation as one. And so what he's essentially doing is creating a voice of unity. Okay, you are all as one, but I think at the same time, he's speaking to each and every individual within the nation, saying, each and every one of you, when I'm speaking to you, see yourself as being addressed personally. And this, of course, is very important to all of us, because I think as we read the Bible, we must always see God's message to us personally. It is a message to the nation of Israel. It is a message to the world. But each and every one of us needs to see ourselves as having been addressed individually. And that gives us a level of responsibility and a level of connectedness that we would not ordinarily have if we're just reading messages, speeches that have been given to crowds. So, okay, that is to give the context of this whole thing. Now, if we see the way this chapters here develop, we talked about the fact that last week that the first speech that Moses gives is a historical speech, and we discussed a bit of that last week, where he's essentially reviewing the events of the past 40 years and drawing some lessons from those events, which he is then giving to the nation. And the second speech is the speech of the commandments. And that speech actually begins, there's kind of like a break in the speeches when we move from second person, Moses just kind of speaking to the nation. And then we have a few verses of third person. And that begins in chapter 4, verse 41. Then Moses separated the three cities on the eastern side of the Jordan. Continues on in verse 44. This is the teaching, or this is the Torah that Moses placed before the nation of Israel. These are verses talking about Moses, not being spoken by Moses. So it's kind of what you might call narrative breaks between Moses's different speeches. And then at the beginning of chapter 5, we say, and Moses summoned all the Israelites, saying to them, and here we have, listen, Israel, Shema Israel, again, listen, Israel, the laws and rules that I proclaim to you this day. And from this point on, at the beginning of chapter 5, this is where we begin the speech that takes up most of the book of Deuteronomy. It may be one speech. I think you could see it as a series of speeches, but the subject of these speeches are all commandments. He's ensuring that the nation understands, he's giving them commandments, discussing commandments. This is not like the historical review that we saw. But I would say that already at the end of chapter 4, beginning in chapter 4, we see essentially a transition between the historical speech and the speech of the commandments, where on the one hand, Moses is still repeating some of the events, but he's using these events in order to segue into the idea of commandments. So if you look at the same verse that we've been talking about now, chapter 4, verse 1, we have that here, Israel, but what is he saying? Listen, okay, to the laws and rules that I am instructing you to observe, so that you may live to enter and occupy the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving you. And then we have a few expressions of history. For example, in verse 3, you saw with your own eyes what the Lord did in the matter of Baal Peor, that the Lord your God wiped out from amongst you every person who followed Baal Peor. So that, on the one hand, is referring to a particular historical event. But then we have in verse 4, while you who held fast to the Lord your God are all alive today. And here it is kind of like a statement of not a statement of faith, but it's an expression of the importance of faith. Okay, those of you who held steadfast in your faith, in your loyalty to God, okay, you are still alive. And then we have verse 5, behold, and here the verb is one of vision, not one of listening. Behold, I have imparted to you laws and rules as the Lord my God has commanded me for you to abide by in the land that you are about to enter and occupy. And then it goes on to talk about different laws and actually becomes then a discussion of the experience of Sinai. We don't yet have the 10 Commandments, but we have the experience of Sinai. Okay, and that is what continues on throughout this chapter until we get to verse 44, which I mentioned earlier. This is the Torah that Moses placed before the nation of Israel. And so in this section, starting in verse 44, we have a third person actual narrative that introduces what will become then the speech regarding the commandments. So even towards the end of the historical speech, as Moses continues to talk about certain historical events like Sinai, like Baal Peor, the message in this end of his speech has to do with the importance of obeying the commandments. Okay, now we have in chapter 5, verse 1, as I mentioned, we have the first time that we actually have these words, listen, O Israel, or hear, O Israel, and we have that in this verse. And then we go on to talk about the 10 Commandments. In chapter 6, verse 1, again, we have here more introduction. This is the instruction or the commandments, the laws and the rules that the Lord your God has commanded me to impart to you to be observed in the land that you are about to cross into and occupy. And again, it talks about the importance of this. In verse 3, obey, O Israel, willingly and faithfully, that may go well with you, that you increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, spoke to you. This is the introduction to the Shema. And so again, it is, you don't have anywhere where Moses is saying, listen up, everybody. I am now going to state something. I'm going to make a statement that's going to rattle your ears. When you finally get to the actual Shema, which is verse 4 in chapter 6, it follows along extremely logically. We've already heard, hear Israel, Israel hear. These are the commandments. These are the commandments. Now I'm going to tell you commandments. Here's some commandments. This is the importance of the commandments. And then you have, here we go. Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God. The Lord is one. Okay. I don't know if when Moses said this to the nation, they suddenly woke up and said, wow, what a statement. I don't know, because it seems to be so, it seems to flow. It just seems to be, another thing that Moses is saying here. Okay. But I think when we look I'm going to also get to the historical relevance of all this. But before we get to how the statement was taken historically and how we see it today, let's just take a look at what it says. So again, on the one hand, it's a natural flow. Listen, Israel, these are the commandments. Okay. And yet, I think, and I'm going to read these verses to you now. Listen to them. And this is chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. This is considered to be the Shema, okay? Not just the first verse, which of course is the key, but all these verses as well. Listen, O hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Take to heart these instructions with which I charge you today. Impress them upon your children. Recite them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So first of all, I would say this first statement, here is the Lord, just this part, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. There is no question. This is a fundamental statement of faith. And it's not just something that will be seen later as a statement of faith. It is a statement of faith. The Lord is our God. The Lord is one. And I think if we think about the revolution that the belief in the God of Israel represented in biblical times, the fact that the Lord is one, okay, is essential. The Lord is one, as opposed to every single other nation at that time who believed that there was a Lord for every single nation. There was a Lord for every land, or there was a Lord for every, natural event, or natural type of nature. In other words, there was a Lord of rain, and there was a Lord of fertility, and there was, a Lord of thunder, and anyone who reads Greek mythology, my goodness, how many different war gods and this god, and this is the context. And so for Moses to say something that Israel already knows, something that came from our forefathers, was passed down, maybe a bit muddled during the time of Egypt. Moses first comes to the nation in Egypt, and this is his message. I come to you in the name of God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But here he's telling the nation, just remember, this is what is important. The Lord is our God. Our God, this is the God of the nation of Israel. At that time, there is no other nation on earth who is going to recognize this God, okay? And the Lord is one. It's not pagan. There's not a few of them. No, one, okay? Now, there's a lovely, lovely Rashi, who I've quoted many times, one of the most important classic fundamental commentators of the Bible, interprets this, the Lord is one, not just that the Lord is one as a statement of monotheism, but the Lord will one day be one. What does that mean? He connects it to the Lord is our God. Today, the Lord is our God. In the future, the Lord will be one. In other words, the Lord will be the only one, because all of the nations of the earth will be unified to recognize God. So today, God is only our God. One day, the God will be one, the one God that is recognized in the universe, the God of all mankind, because all mankind, of course, will recognize him. He is the God of all mankind. But this idea being that all mankind will recognize and crown him as the God of the one God of the universe. Okay, now then we go to verse 5. You should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. What does this mean? First of all, love. Okay, until now we had Moses talking about, for just 2 verses earlier, we have in verse 2, so that you, your children, and your children's children may fear the Lord or revere the Lord. That is not love. There are 2 elements, of course, and Moses is always playing this back and forth. You need to obey God. For why? So you don't want to get punished. You should do it. God is an awesome God. You have to fear God. You have to obey God. Here, we have a completely different item introduced, and that's love. Love God. When you love God, you will want to do what he wants you to do, okay? Not just coming from fear. And our sages have said that loving God is a far higher level of connection with God than fearing God. And you think about a child, or some, very often you want your child to do the right thing and to obey, okay? And so until he understands how important it is for him to do that, you need to use a carrot and a stick kind of thing. If you do the right thing, I'll give you a reward. If you do the wrong thing, you'll get punishment. That's very important. But at some point, a child matures and understands the intrinsic value of what he needs to do. And around that same time, he understands how his parents have done this, have instilled these values in him because they love him. They weren't there to mete out punishment or reward. They weren't Santa Claus, and they weren't, the big bad guy. Their parents are the source of love, and it's through love that the parents are teaching the child to do the right thing. So it's a progress. That people have to mature. And so basically, what Moses is saying here, this is the next level. Okay, you need to mature from obeying God because you have to obeying God because you love God and you appreciate all that God is there for you, and therefore you love God with all your heart, with everything, all your love. That's an expression of love. With all your soul. And here Rashi says, what does it mean with all your soul? You need to be ready to give your life for the love of God. with all your might. Here Rashi defines that. What is might? Not your physical might, but your possessions. Your might very often what is your power? What is your whatever is very often defined by what you own. And therefore basically being willing to sacrifice what you have for the love of God. Now, this, of course, as we'll talk about that. Well, you know what? I'm going to get back to that. I want to move on to the next two verses, and then we'll come back to this. Okay, verse 7. Teaching your children, speaking about this all the time. Okay, this here, teaching your children, this has become the source of one of the sources of a very important obligation that's placed on every Jewish parent to teach the children to love God, to teach children Torah, to teach children the Bible. Okay, and it's coming from here. And the idea being, well, if you love God, you have to communicate that to the next generation. And the way to continue the love of God in the next generation is by teaching that. This is not just some, I fell in love with some cute guy. It's not that kind of love. It's much deeper than that, and therefore must be taught. And then we have here, you should be talking about God when you're sitting in your home, as you walk on the way, when you get up, and in the morning. So here you have this idea of the word of God should be on your lips at all times. You should be thinking about it. You should be speaking of it. And it's when it says, as you walk along the way, let's see what exactly, so when you are away, but it's not just when you walk around, it's as, if I'm going to translate it literally, as you're walking along the way. So this idea is, no matter what you're doing, the pettiest, most not important thing that you are doing in your daily routines, there is no daily routine that's too simple or that's too unimportant, then you can't have God in your mind as you're following those routines. You should always be thinking, even as you're washing the dishes, as you talk to people, as whatever you're doing, am I doing it in the way I should be doing it to walk with God? Okay, am I doing this with love of God? Am I doing this with a desire to sanctify God's name? This is part of your everyday activities as you get up and as you go to sleep. From this, our sages have taught us, and this is indeed part of Jewish law, that we say the Shema, we say this prayer, the Shema, every single morning and every single evening. Okay. Now, some people say you only have to say it once a day, but most people say that, you need to, Jews should be saying Shema every morning and every evening. So it's not just, and I think the purpose of that is not that you should just be reciting a mantra twice a day, but it's part of experiencing this idea that the love of God should be with you at all times. And then we have verse 8, you will tie this as a sign on your arms, and it should be as something. There's a word totafot. It's a very weird word. It's not exactly clear what it means. Okay. But this verse has been interpreted, and this is how it's been in Jewish tradition forever and ever and ever. There's something called tefillin. In English, it's translated as phylacteries. Okay. These are these boxes, leather boxes with leather straps, and you wear one on your head. It's men who do this, not women, and men after the age of bar mitzvah will put this box on their head and another box on their arm. What is in these boxes? These are these verses of the Shema, plus a few other verses that are placed adjacent to the Shema in the prayer book, and in these boxes, critical verses that teach us about loving God, our commandments to obey God, and to have this always on our heart, on our head, and where it says between our eyes here. Okay, it's the head near the forehead over here, and on our arms. And indeed, where you put it, you usually put the phylacteries on your left arm, and for those who are righties, and if you're a lefty, you put it on your right arm. Okay, but it is turned inward to aim at the heart. The idea being you have put these verses on your arm, but it's aimed at the heart, which is, of course, the source of our love. And you should write these verses, okay? Write this, meaning these verses, verse 9, on the mezuzot. These are these little boxes where, again, these verses are inscribed on these verses, and we put them in every doorpost on our houses, in entrance to our gardens. Whenever you have a gate or a door in or outside our houses, you are going to put these things. So this is just an example of how this verse is not just something that becomes a statement of faith and an idea that we repeat to ourselves, but they have actually been interpreted into very specific practical ways that are all Jews do in order to remember God and keep this amongst us. Now, what has happened, and this is where I want to go back to this verse, with all your soul. Indeed, this verse, this verse itself, where it says, love God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This all your soul, even at the price of martyrdom, even if you will have to give your life for the love of God. What does this mean? If you're in a situation where you are being challenged, where someone wants to force you to convert, where someone is killing you because you are a Jew, this is a situation of martyrdom. And this, whereas Judaism does not encourage martyrdom in the sense that don't look for opportunities to die, look for opportunities to live. But on the other hand, faced with this choice of giving up on God or giving your life, you are supposed to give your life. And this is how this verse has been interpreted. And in fact, unfortunately, Jewish people have been subjected not only to anti-Semitism, but over the centuries to all kinds of situations where they were forced by terrible oppressors to give up their faith, and were put to the test. Are you going to agree to give up your faith, or will you stand firm, even if it means giving your life? And we know, for example, if we go as recently as the Holocaust, when so many Jews, as they were going to the gas chambers, when they knew that there was nothing they could do, they were facing death, or whether they were being lined up against those terrible killing pits and shot, and they knew that they were about to be killed. What was the verse that they yelled, that they cried out? It was this verse, the Shema. And I'll tell you the truth, though, in the most calm situation, if a person is dying, if he's on his deathbed and he knows he's dying, he's about to meet his maker. This is also a verse we say. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. This is a verse that we say before we meet our maker, just so that we can declare, yes, we know you are our God. We know you are one. I am ready to meet you. And in fact, when someone dies a very peaceful death, sometimes dies with having lost consciousness, their loved ones very often standing with them will say it for them, will recite the Shema, knowing that that is something that they would want to have said had they been conscious and able to be aware of their impending death. There's one story though that I want to say, and I don't know, I think there's this story I think was very, very instrumental at cementing this idea of the Shema as this, not just a statement of faith, but a statement of faith in the face of persecution, in the face of martyrdom. Rabbi Akiva lived after the failure of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Hadrian, who was the Roman emperor of the time, declared terrible decrees and persecution against the Jewish people, very much zeroing in on religious persecution. No studying of the Bible, no teaching of the Bible, no performing circumcision. These decrees were aimed not only at political dissent, but to try to wipe out the Jewish identity and the Jewish faith. And therefore, it was a time of testing. Would these rabbis, would the people of Israel stand up and continue to spread Torah as much as possible? And Rabbi Akiva was a rabbi who was caught because he was teaching Torah, and he was tortured and murdered. And as he was tortured, he knew he was on his last minutes of life. And his students standing around him watching this terrible, terrible man, this situation of a man being tortured to death. And they say to him, how could it be? How could it be that a man as great and as righteous as you are suffering so greatly for your devotion to God, for your love of God? And what was his answer? He said to them, all these years I studied this verse, You should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And I loved him with all my heart, and I loved him with all my might. He was very, very poor. He gave up everything. He was very poor, gave up all opportunities in order to study. He said, but I always felt bad that I was never able to fulfill this part of the commandment with all your soul. And now God has given me the opportunity to do that, to die for the love of God. And then he recited Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And just as he finished saying the word Echad, he died.
Oh.
This is, of course, a powerful story, and is a story that has been passed. It is written in the Talmud, but it's also passed down from generation to generation. And it has helped to forge this idea, not only that this is a statement of faith, but it is a statement of faith that requires of us to remain firm in our faith, even as we face persecution and torture and all kinds of things. So, it has been a very, very important statement. It's a very important verse. I would say it's probably far more important today than when Moses first said it, because it has been infused with so much meaning and so much experience. But this is fundamental to Judaism today. You can all unmute yourselves. If you have anything to say or comment, I'd love to hear it.
Thank you, Sondra. That was wonderful.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay. So it was good to see you all. Have a wonderful weekend. Shabbat shalom. And I'll see you again next week. And I will try to make sure to get that reminder email out in time next week. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you, Sondra.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below, as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.